This morning, Kevin Bradley will offer the reflection. Kevin is on the board of directors for Final Exit Network, which is the largest national organization supporting end-of-life freedom for anyone of sound mind facing an intolerable quality of life. He recently developed an online course about the right to die for the American Humanist Association. He has served as chaplain with several regional and national hospitals and hospice providers.
Hello. Good morning. Actually, I feel compelled to say top of the morning to ye. That was wonderful. Thank you. I've had the pleasure of having some email conversations, and discovering we have a lot in common. Both music majors once upon a day, and both at TCU more recently. So I'd like to do a little bit different process this morning. Rather than me just talk at you, I'd like to have more of a dialogue. So I'm going to invite you to ask questions. Interrupt me if you feel so moved. I may say, I'll get to that, or I may ask you to wait until afterwards if you still have the same question. But I'd like this to be more of a conversation than me just up here preaching at you. I'm here with Melanie. Say hi, Melanie. Right. So we actually drove down from Minnesota. Normally when I do come down to Fort Worth fairly often because of my association with TCU, but usually I fly down, do this, and fly back. But we just decided to make this the first stop of vacation. She has relatives over in Longview that we're going to go see, and so we left Friday and drove down to a little bit farther than Kansas City, and then came down here the rest of the way. So it's wonderful to hear the birds and get out of the frozen tundra. They're just wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. So, yeah, this is very nostalgic for us because, of course, seeing all the signs to Brighton, Barry, and TCU. But I didn't know about this church when I was here. But Melanie and I used to live over by East Pascal High School. So very close. So this is kind of our stomping grounds once upon a time. So, yes, I am a hospice and a hospital chaplain, or I was. I'm not doing that actively anymore. My ministry actually now is devoted to Final Exit Network. I was very fortunate in my life to, after 20-some years in the corporate world, I went to seminary at the age of 49. I call it because I had a midlife crisis, because we're all supposed to have a midlife crisis, I guess. So I did go to seminary, and at that time I was planning to be a Unity minister. Anybody familiar with Unity? Okay, so I've heard Unity and UUs called, kissing cousins or whatever, and we're always mistaken for each other because of the similarity in our name. So I feel very at home in the UU. Just very comfortable for me here. But chaplaincy, becoming a chaplain was not on my radar at all. I was planning to be just a Sunday morning preacher in Unity Church, but then life happened. For a very brief time, I was a transitional pastor at a UCC church in our hometown. She and I actually went to high school together. But we didn't see each other for 34 years after that, and then she found me on Facebook, and one of those Facebook things. So, but after that little experience, I kind of fell into a chaplain residency at a VA hospital. Well, it just happens to be that my son had enlisted in the Air Force the same year that I started seminary. And he came back from Afghanistan with this thing called post-traumatic stress disorder. I had no clue what to do, but here I was as a chaplain at a VA hospital, and they said, "Is there anything you want to specialize in?" And I'm like, mental health, PTSD, help me so I can help him. Of course, I'm thinking I'm going to learn how to fix him. And it doesn't work that way. What I did learn is that PTSD often comes with depression, clinical depression, and the symptoms can be very close. But if the difference is not accurately diagnosed and treated, oftentimes it ends up becoming addiction. So then you've got that whole thing. All those things together, and there are so many overlapping things. So that was sort of my world for a while. Well, one of the things I learned is how profound some spiritual solutions can be. How many of you ever heard there's no atheist in a foxhole? Well, I'm telling you, there are a lot of atheists after the bullets stop flying, because they all say, God, where were you? They may be praying in the foxhole, but when the bullets stop flying, they're saying, no, I'm done with that stuff. So I've met a lot of veterans who came home from wherever, and their world had changed because they had changed, and they weren't treated quite the same. We've all heard horror stories about Vietnam veterans coming back, very different welcome or no welcome. But we just have a different culture now, more openly anti-war, more openly questioning government, and all kinds of things. Anyway, so that's part of my story and how I got involved in things. So rather than being a minister now full-time, I actually got pulled back into my previous career as a technical writer, which pays better than being a minister. But it allows me to do this kind of thing and not have to worry about the income. One of the other things I do as part of my ministry is on a private basis, totally love offering, is I am able to use what I learn works for veterans with post-traumatic stress disorder as a spiritual approach to providing holistic stress management. And so that's one of the things I do now, just sort of on the side, when it comes and goes. And what I have found is that in this work, Right to Life, and when people are nearing the end, talk about stress management. It's big time stress management involved in those things. There's no more emotional time than a funeral. And I can't tell you how many times I've seen family feuds start at a funeral because there's a lot of anger, a lot of grief, a lot of sorrow, and they just don't know what to do with it. And so they end up attacking each other. So I totally went off on a tangent there. I'm off my script completely. So let's just jump into this. So we can go to the slide. All right, so that's me, Final Exit Network. Okay, so where do you want to die? Say again?
At home.
At home, yes. 80%, statistically, 80% of people say they want to die at home. A few years ago, I spoke to a group of freethinkers up in northern Minnesota, and one lady from the back said, on a zip line with my hair on fire. So I'm like, alrighty then. But most people want to die at home. So 80% of people want to die at home. What percentage of people actually do die at home? Next slide, please. This is likely your end, statistically. 60% of us will die something like this, whether it's in a hospital ICU or some kind of intensive care. Another 20% of us will die in a nursing home, probably also hooked up to something. Well, there's 60 and 20, 80. That leaves 20% who actually die at home with some control over their own end. Next slide, please. I'm going to read this to you in case you can't see it. Medical ethics prevent me from assisting you in your death. However, I'm allowed to keep you miserable as long as possible. I saw that a lot in hospitals. Next slide, please. Medicare spending chart. This blew me away, first thing I heard about it. Well over, see where do I go here? Well over 60% of all of our Medicare spending happens in the last year of our life. Half of that in the last 60 days of life. And that last bar, 40% in the last 30 days of your life. All of our Medicare spending is in the last 30 days of your life. And a lot of people that I knew in the hospital and the hospice didn't want that to happen. They didn't want to be here. They were done, but they kept treating them like pincushions. So fine, you pay your taxes. What's wrong with getting Medicare and getting all that money back during the last days or weeks of your life? Absolutely nothing wrong with that. But what if you don't want to? I loved earlier you talked about the freedom, the knowledge from freedom. And then you talked about Viktor Frankl, the power of choice. One thing we don't have a lot of choice about is how we choose to exit this physical life. The politicians are against us, the healthcare system, everything else. Okay, next slide, please. Holding support the right to die. The grump over there, I support the right to needlessly suffer. And she's saying, at least you're honest. They don't make any bones about that, actually. So let's talk about that a little bit. In most states, you have an option. If you know that you're terminally ill, you have an option of either refusing medication, and by the way, a lot of people don't even realize that. You don't have to take the medication they give you. And by the way, something I learned in the hospital is you can fire your doctor. You can say, no thank you, I would like somebody else. You don't have to take the help that they send you. I would like a different doctor, I'd like a different nurse, please. You have that right. Most people don't know that. So you can refuse medication, you can refuse nutrition, you can refuse drinking. In fact, they actually have a medical term for it, voluntary cessation of eating and drinking, VSED. They go around talking about VSED so that people don't know what they're talking about. And that basically means the patient in 4A is starving him or herself to death because they're done and we don't want to help them. So, you have that option, but you only have that option if you can speak. What if you can't speak for yourself? Half the time you end up in the hospital because you're unconscious. Well, how many of you have a health care directive? Okay, how about a living will or something like it? Okay, now the tough question. How many of you have the families who know where it is? Good for you. Good for you. So if you cannot speak for yourself, I can guarantee you that the ER staff and the hospital staff, they will do whatever they have to keep your body pumping, unless your health care directive says otherwise. But then, a little secret, they don't necessarily follow your health care directive, especially if your health care directive violates their policy, especially if their hospital has roots in the church. I worked for a hospital called Mercy Hospital. Once upon a time, it belonged to the church, hence the name Mercy. Many hospitals at one time were owned by a church. Maybe now they're not so much, but those policies run deep. So your wishes may not be honored in a hospital depending on its policies. Let's go to the next slide. The pain and the needless suffering cartoon I had up there, the Catholic Church is famous for this. The Catholic Church will often say, but you're supposed to suffer. They call it redemptive suffering. Anybody heard that? Yeah. Perfect. I love the eyebrows go, redemptive suffering? Okay, sorry for my French, but what the hell is that? Redemptive suffering. Well, the idea is it's based on Corinthians, where Paul said to the church in Corinth, something to the effect of, I can't even find my quote, I'm so far off my script. But the point is that if you suffer, good things can come from it. Well, great. We all know that. Any adversity can make us stronger. Great. Your end-stage cancer, suffering will make you stronger so that you can what? Get up and go do something? No. But the Catholics talk about the redemptive suffering. Pope John Paul II took that one phrase out of context. I frankly think I can make a theological argument that he was out to lunch, but he actually put in this Latin thing saying that suffering makes you more like Christ. Because Jesus suffered, Jesus put suffering together with salvation, therefore suffering is salvation. And you see how the kind of weird connecting of the dots here? It's like, no, and I'm not going along with that at all. I totally agree that if we suffer in life, and we do, the noble truths of Buddhism, life is suffering, but actually causing someone to suffer, I'm sorry, that doesn't make you a better Christian, that makes you sadistic. I've had people go, oh, you can't use that word. I'm sorry, it is. It's just when you actually encourage people to suffer, there's just nothing holy about that. So, but the Catholics say that pain and suffering, you need to suffer. I don't even bother arguing with people who keep talking about but you're supposed to suffer, it's good for you, be more like Jesus and yada, yada, yada. I get to surprise them by saying, guess what? The number one reason why people want right to die options has nothing to do with pain. Most cases, modern medicine actually can mitigate most of the pain. Not all, but most of them. And give you enough morphine, more drugs, doc, come on, keep it coming, Most pain can be minimized with that. But guess what? The number one reason why people want to exercise right to die or death with dignity?
Helplessness.
Exactly. The term they call it is loss of autonomy or loss of dignity. So you often hear the right to die called death with dignity. I tend not to use death with dignity as a phrase because my work in hospice, part of the hospice is to provide dignity. So I just try to program myself to say right to die rather than death with dignity, because if I tell hospice professionals that they're not death with dignity, I've lost them in the conversation. So I want to talk about right to die rather than death with dignity. But that's just ultimately what we're talking about, is dignity. Now, who decides what dignity is? Yes, only you can decide what dignity means to you. Even in the hospice, people say, well, look at that. We've got the flowers and the plants, we've got the music, and he's surrounded by love. It's a dignified death. No, thank you, because I'm waiting for someone to change my diapers. I'm 85 years old, and there's nothing dignified about that. The parents may say, oh, you're not a bother, but I can't tell you how many times I've talked to people who say, it doesn't matter. I'm done. I'm tired of being a burden. And I hear the same thing from my mother. She's 96. Her biggest thing is, oh, I don't want to be a burden on anybody. Fine. Every once in a while I'm thinking, Mom, you know what I do, right? Final Exit Network, I can help you out if you're really, if you're ready. It's actually several years ago, we had a little heart incident. She said, I'm ready to go be with your dad. My dad died when I was in college. I was 21. And so it's been a long time. So she said, I'm ready to go be with your dad. In the last 2 or 3 years, she has several times. Every day I wake up, I'm surprised I'm still here. But she plays her Mexican train 3 times a week, and she's fine. Let's move on here. The other thing that religious folks will throw at us often is it's a sin, that suicide is a sin. Well, guess what? The Bible doesn't say that. In the New Testament and Old Testament, now, you and Unity folks alike, sometimes it's like, okay, we don't really deal with that as much as other people do, but this is the argument that people will use in our conversation. So I just want to give you just a little bit of ammunition, or at least so you know where they're coming from. But the point is, you have Matthew's in the New Testament. So everybody knows who Judas is, or if you grew up, you hear about Judas. He hanged himself after he betrayed Jesus. The lower ones are all the Old Testament folks. Ever heard of Samson, the third one down? I grew up in the church, Sunday school. They told me Samson was a hero. He pulled down the pillars on the Philistines, those nasty Philistines. So all these people essentially killed themselves, one way or another. None of those verses ever talk about that being a bad thing. So why do they say suicide is a bad thing? Well, the reason they say suicide is a bad thing, and this to me is one of the most interesting trivia things of all. The reason suicide is considered immoral or unethical or whatever has nothing to do with God. Now, you will find religious people saying, well, it's God's supposed to decide whether you live or die. And I heard actually people in the hospitals, they would, quoting scripture, they wanted everything possible done to their loved one. The next person comes in holding scripture saying, I want nothing done because it's not in the Bible. And they're usually quoting the same scripture. So how do you know what's the will of God? Well, usually it's whatever you want is the will of God. Funny how that happens all the time. So you have the suicide thing going on, and people will say, well, we can't call it suicide. Well, let's just use the word for a second, find out why was the word suicide, why was it ever illegal? The reason it was illegal is because back in the day, you did not own yourself. You were a subject of the king or the queen, subject to the whims of the king or the queen. Now, if you give your life in battle, if you're a soldier for the king's army, and if you throw your life into battle, you are giving your life for the king. Awesome. But if you're not a soldier doing that at the king's command, and if you take your own life, think about that phrase, taking your life. Taking it from whom exactly? You're taking your life from the king because you don't own your life. The king does. You are the king's subject. That's the history of why suicide was ever illegal, because you don't own your body. The king owns you. And why does the king want you to stay alive? Dead people don't pay taxes. Even today, we've been watching reruns of Boston Legal. And I love courtroom dramas, but the other day there was one that talked about the state's interest in preserving life. Well, what exactly does that mean? Why is the state so interested in keeping us alive? Dead people don't pay taxes. It's the same today as it was 500 years ago. The state wants you alive in order to fund the state. That's the single biggest reason for this phrase, the state's interest is in keeping you alive. So the right to life, all these arguments, whenever they talk about the state's interest, that's what it is how to keep the state going, how to prop up the state, how to keep politicians in office. So the opposition is very well organized. It's the Catholic Church, the right to life crowd, and often they're the same thing, and the religious fundamentalists, all right? So that's the opposition. But there are also, you have the healthcare industry. They don't want you to die. They want to keep you going for the Medicare thing. All right, let's move on to the next slide. All right, this is my favorite thing, one of my favorite things here. I have too many favorites, sorry. Religious folks will often talk about the sixth commandment, which I learned as thou shalt not kill. Did you all learn it that way too? Right, guess what? That's wrong. It does not say that. In the original Hebrew, it does not say thou shalt not kill. It says thou shalt not murder. The difference is very important. In the ancient Hebrew, the word murder was very specifically defined as the deliberate taking of another's life with malice. And those three words that I've underlined are important. First of all, the word taking is defined in Hebrew as acquiring something without the consent of the owner. All right, well, if I am ending my own life, first of all, it's not another's life, so that just doesn't qualify. If I'm asking you to help me end my suffering or help me end my life, that's not taking it, you're just doing me a favor, so that doesn't qualify. If I am ending my life, it's not another's life, so that doesn't qualify. And I defy anybody to show me a situation where there is a death with dignity going on, where there is malice involved. I have never seen more love. There's no malice, it's not about another's life, it's not about the taking. Therefore, no matter how you define it, suicide or assisted suicide does not violate the sixth commandment. Never has, never will. Next slide, please. We have good news. Even though the Catholic Church and the Pope officially says we oppose the right death with dignity, that middle slide shows that 70% of Catholics agree with medical aid in dying as an option. The evangelicals, we got some work to do. All right, let's move forward to that. Next slide. Okay, so we've talked about medical aid in dying mostly. That's what people hear about. So it's now legal in 6 states plus Washington, D.C. Well, there are some very, very strict requirements to qualify for medical aid in dying. First of all, you have to be diagnosed with a terminal illness, and the doctor has to say, I think this person is going to be dead in 6 months. Check that one. You have to submit a written request to the physician. You have to make 2 oral requests to the physician, and they have to be 15 days apart. You have to have the written request witnessed by 2 people, and one of them cannot be related to you. And you must be of sound mind throughout this whole process. If you qualify for all those things, and if you happen to live in one of those 6 states or Washington, D.C., then you have medical aid in dying as an option. However, what if you have Parkinson's disease? Not necessarily fatal, and we have no idea how long you're going to live. What if you have MS or MD or ALS or cancer or congestive heart, any of these things, there's no end time to it. I got a call yesterday on the way down here. I'm going to go visit somebody who saw her father die from cancer, whose sister is right now in the end stages of cancer, and she was diagnosed with Alzheimer's. She called us up. Final Exit Network, I'd like to talk with you. Because she saw her father went through. So what if you have a constellation of these things? What do you do? First of all, even if it was legal in Texas, you don't, because of this you won't qualify. That's where Final Exit Network comes in. And this is going to make some people uncomfortable. We help you figure out the most painless, peaceful, and certain way for you to completely control the end of your life. I see a little energy shift here, just the thought of that, especially if you're younger. Now, if you're older, I see a lot of people in crowds where they're talking to older people and the elders in the community, and they're all like, well, yeah, thank you, please. So let's go on to the next slide, please. Final Exit Network, 3,000 members nationwide. There are almost 80 volunteers now, and including several ministers. I'm one of 2 ordained ministers that are on the board. I am on the board. I would start on the Speakers Bureau. I am an exit guide, and I'm also now one of the spiritual advisors. I have clients, and last week, the mother of somebody who had exited called me just because she said, you helped my son so much. Can you please talk to me? And I have those conversations frequently, and that has become a ministry. Next slide, please. So the FEN difference. You do not need a medical diagnosis that says you're going to have 6 months or less to live. You do have to have a medical condition that says this will likely kill me. May not happen in the next 6 months, but this is going to effectively end my life, or at the very least, I'm going to end up in this shriveling heap on the bed over there and I won't have any control. So you do not need to have a diagnosis of 6 months or less. Now, while Compassion and Choices, and I didn't mention them earlier, Compassion and Choices organization is the biggest one back there. They're the people who actually write the legislation for health, for death with dignity. They do that, and it's wonderful work, and we need them to do that. I'm a member of them. But while they're working on the legislation, we focus on researching new ways, new drugs, new things. Because if we have one drug out there, and then society finds out that people are killing themselves with this drug, suddenly the FDA takes it off the market, or various things. So what we do is we support research into peaceful means for self-deliverance. And the other difference is that Compassion and Choices is a professional organization where they, a lot of paid staff, but other than we have one executive director who's paid, but the rest of us are all volunteers. So next slide, please. We're going to switch through these. Our mission: we educate qualified individuals in practical, peaceful ways to end their lives, offer a compassionate bedside presence, and defend your right to choose. We will go to court for you. We have been to court for you. I have personally been to court for you. I have testified in the Minnesota Senate on behalf of the Right to Die bill in a Senate hearing. I was one of 2 clergy on that side of the aisle. Catholics, Missouri Synod Lutherans, and others were on the other side of the aisle. Next slide, please. To qualify, you must be mentally competent. You must have an existing or reasonably anticipated unbearable suffering or unacceptable, intolerable quality of life with no reasonable hope of improvement. In other words, we ain't kidding around with you. So if you just are tired, it ain't going to work. You do need to qualify. We do have some standards. You need to be aware of your treatment options. Have you gone through chemo? Have you done all those things? You need to be aware of them. You do not need to take them, but you need to convince us that you know they're there. And then you have to inform, or at least tell us that you're willing to inform your family. That basically is what your qualifications are in order for Final Exit Network to come and talk to you. And then we turn it over to the medical committee, and they decide whether or not, you're really qualified. So it's a very strict regimen. Next slide, please. What can you do now? This is actually where it started. Final Exit was the book written by Derek Humphrey after he helped his wife in England after she suffered for a couple of years with breast cancer. He started the movement. He moved to America. He started the Hemlock Society in 1980, and that grew, and now one of them's Compassion Choices, and the other side is Final Exit Network. So I have met Derek. I think he's getting close to 90 himself. So next slide, please. Living will registry, even if you go to the hospital, if you have a living will, is it on file in that particular hospital? Maybe not. We are in partnership with these folks, so when you go to the hospital, into the ER, I can guarantee you they're going to go through your wallet because they're looking for contact information. If you become a member of Final Exit Network, you automatically become a living will registry. Talking too fast. What that does is you end up with a card, like a driver's license or a credit card, in your wallet. The ER folks reach through that. Oh, living will registry. He's got a health directive. Everybody stop. So that's one advantage if you want to become a member. By the way, there's no cost for membership unless you want this. So you can become a member without paying a dime. If you do want to become a member, it's like $25 or $50 or something. This is why. It's because of this. All right, next slide, please. So what can you do? Final Exit, read the book. Go online, look for it. It's at the libraries. Please talk to your family now. And I don't mean next week. I mean today. Call them up saying, I got something very important I want to talk to you. I don't know how to start this conversation. This is important. If you're interested, become a member now. Make sure that you have your power of attorney for health care. You have your advanced care directives. Read it to your family. Everybody sit down. Instead of playing Monopoly or cards, you're going to talk about your advanced care directives. It's not going to be fun. By the way, call me. One of the things I do is I help people have those conversations. Single best thing you can do for us right now is tell others that we exist. We have stopped trying to persuade people because we have discovered that most Americans actually agree with us. And I cannot tell you how many times I've had this conversation where people say, I wish I had known about you before. So just please tell everybody that you know about this thing called Final Exit Network. All right, next slide. And what about our right to choose what you do? That's what it comes down to. Your life, your death, your choice. Knowledge and freedom, and as we heard today from Viktor Frankl, it's about your right to choose. Next slide, please. My favorite billboard in the world, I have no idea where this is. Next slide. That's me. That is my personal cell phone number. You are welcome to call me with any questions. That's my email. I do blog about stuff occasionally. So that's my website is chaplainslog.com. That's me. Thank you for your time. I'm going to be hanging around in the living room if anybody has any questions.